Good. Welcome, everybody. If you're in the room, please come and take a seat here. Let me just say, for the benefit of the online audience who are joining now, and for the benefit of those who are in the room, you came back from lunch very promptly. So you are all winners. You are all winners in the room so far. So just carry that with you for the rest of the day, something to feel good about. And goodness knows there aren't that many as we look at the international news at the moment, are there? But I think this is a terrific panel because it cuts to the heart of the idea of how you build resilience in systems, and that's something that we're all very interested in. It also sets up a very interesting conundrum as to whether there is a dichotomy between growth and resilience, or whether the two things actually can work together and are inextricably linked in some sense. So let me introduce you to the panel, and then we'll kick off with the conversation here. Let me start on my right. Julia Klückner is with us, Member of Parliament for the Federal Assembly of Germany. Thank you for being here. We should introduce Saad Rahim, Chief Strategist and Global Head of Research at Trafigura here in Switzerland. Trafigura is a commodity trading business, as I'm sure many of you will know, so we're looking for some interesting perspective, particularly in that area, I think, security of supply and so forth. Naoko Ishii is Director of the Center for Global Commons at the University of Tokyo, Japan. Good to have you with us. And Sarah Otter is the Global Chief Risk Officer for Deloitte USA. So I was barely in this room, just to fill you in, before I was mugged collectively by our panel, who seem outraged by the very idea that resilience and growth are not connected ideas and somehow they're working in opposition. And Naoko, since you seem to be the most angry, can I perhaps ask you to start here? So what is wrong with the premise that there is somehow a conflict between growth and resilience?
Well, I was so puzzled and outraged with this the underlying assumption that the growth and resilience are at odds or are not compatible. Because what we have learned for the last decade or so is that the sustainable growth needs to incorporate resilience, a lot of elements, which is helping to build a resilience. So what have we learned if we still have to ask that question? So that was my source of the frustration. And the world, the entire world has already learned that then we cannot just continue the very linear growth, only just the nominal GDP kind of growth. And that's why that in 2015 we had the SDG, we had Paris Agreement to incorporate those elements which the current economic model kind of, that they ignored. So that so at that high cost, we have learned how to incorporate a kind of resilience with a natural system, more like a climate change, but also how to incorporate a social system or human capital, because we learn so much about the just transition. It's so important. So I thought this globe learned from the past decade or so that the sustainable development needs to incorporate those elements in it. So that's why that when I got the question, are we going back a decade ago to that the COVID-19, that the Ukraine situation added more challenge, and some part of this world is now talking about self-sufficiency or security, which may actually that going backward in my own philosophy. But then still we need to see that that the sustainable growth without resilience will not be really that bring that the right thing to the future.
So is it growth, or is it the ability of communities to form agreements and work together in the same direction, maybe through multilateral organizations and non-governmental bodies, that's equally as important here? Because it's interesting, you've cited a number of recent crises that we've experienced, and a lot of the heat was taken out of those crises ultimately by international cooperation and not necessarily by a go-it-alone strategy. Can I just ask you to expand a little bit on whether growth alone is the solution.
Yeah. Again, in fact, we have learned or gained through this past decade, particularly after 2012, that this Rio de Janeiro summit and Sustainable Development 20 years is basically, it's not good enough for the only states to come up with a strategy. We need to bring those non-state actors, so stakeholders, multi-stakeholders together to really push and not just chart the pathway, but also implement that pathway. And just that other state cannot do that. And in addition to that, this multi-stakeholder partnership needs to really show the world this is the direction we should go. Then which will actually the sources of a lot of innovation, the courage to bring us to get over the social economic tipping points. That's why this the new, what we have learned the past decade or so is extremely valuable, and I'm worried that we are losing that importance of international collaboration, not just by state, but the multi-stakeholder actors to make it happen.
Probably, as you said that, the preeminent organization I think of in Europe is probably the EU and then the Eurozone, which has brought a big group of countries together on a lot of similar issues. There is obviously still work to be done because there's a lot of disagreement in many, many areas. Banking union is something I talk a lot about, as is capital markets union, but of course migration, immigration, and so on and so forth. Julia, maybe this is a good point to bring you in, perhaps to share with us some of the benefits, but maybe some of the challenges.
At first, resilience and growth are the two sides of one coin, I would say. So, and the question is which growth is meant? The growth of companies, of national economy, of European economy, or common rule-based economy worldwide? So this is a definition question, of course. But to your question concerning the European Union, so we are 27 members, and really different members, and each nation has got his own interests, of course, but we have also common interests. I think we did, the European Union, the Commission, did a really good work together with the member states in struggling with the coronavirus, for example. But we have also lessons learned from it, and I think the benefit is to learn from a crisis in order to implement it in the criteria or the instruments for a next crisis, in order to learn to reach the next step of cooperation. Second point is the debate in the European Union about migration, the debate about defense. Do we need a common defense force? Or is it really effective to maintain in each nation or member state a smaller military union? So I think we need more common defense strategy and defense financing, I would say, because 27 different military strategies are not really effective. So this is the second point, and I would say our advantages are that we have to discuss with each other and have to find compromises. It's not easy, it's hard work, I would say. As a former minister in Angela Merkel's the last cabinet, I was the federal minister responsible for food and agriculture. And we have had this presidential of the EU Präsidentschaft, the presidency we have had, and I have had to organize a common policy for food and agriculture. And you can imagine how different it is. Look to Spain, look to France, or to the Scandinavian countries. So we have quite different agriculture, quite different economy, and quite different consumers. But I think this pressure to find compromises helps us to understand each other. And I was really afraid in in this pandemic, in the times of the coronavirus, that protectionism increased, and we need to work more together and find out who are our strategic partners, what are our values, and then fight for it.
The bloc is sometimes accused of being slow in policy response, and the topic before us is how do you boost risk, foresight and resilience, and how does the drive for efficiency help resilience or risk eroding it? How would the drive for a faster responding EU help or hinder, do you think, at this stage? Because I know there have been efforts to structurally reform the voting system, perhaps to prioritize those members who are bigger contributors financially, but they haven't really gone very far so far.
That's it. The European Union is growing bigger and bigger, or it's become fast more members, and the family is really big, and on the table there's sitting a lot of people or children or name it, and they have their own wishes. And I think the Green Deal or the strategy Fit for 55, it's so, or to help or to support our industry in Europe. It's so complicated. I learned a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. It's much easier. You describe the aim, you describe some tools, but companies and managers and they decide how to do it. But in the European Union, there is a love to regulate nearly everything, and you have to read 400 pages in order to understand something, and after that you don't understand anything. And sometimes I think the regulations are made for people who are writing the regulations. It's a job description, and we need we really need perhaps more pressure, or we need more alliance in the European Union. We were allied with Great Britain, for example. They paid a lot, we pay a lot, and there were common interests there. But next year we will have the elections, and you can realize that the Commission or the different commissioners from different parties now point out their new positions, what they have in mind. But at least it depends on majority, of course. But the bureaucracy, the documentation, the duties we have got, it's not effective. It isn't. So we want this climate change to stop. We want to be more sustainable. We need wind turbines. But in order to get a wind turbine planned or built, you need 6 years, 5 or 6 years. So it's not possible to reach your goal then.
Wow. That's,
sorry, but I love the European Union.
So what do you think? I mean, this is a panel about creating resilience and responding appropriately to speed solutions. What is the right answer to Europe's dilemma?
I think to realize the dilemma, and we do it. That's the first step. Second is that we realize that there are a lot of crises and we need partners. And if we compare our behavior or solutions with others, we can learn. I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. And third point is we are under pressure. Look at Russia, the lessons learned from this conflict. Russia, China, Iran, or India, who is working together? What are is there a new polarized world? And we are close to the classical partners, I would say, and we have to underline that. And this, I think, this is the point of solution. If we work together with others, and for trade agreement, for example, 10 years ago, everybody in the European Union thought that we can teach others out of the world. We are on the moral higher level. The sustainable goals, everything into agreement, into a trade agreement. This wouldn't be as successful. And the European Union or the Commission realized that. And I think now we must and we have to rely on these partnerships, and so we need compromise. And this is the pressure from outside in order to be more effective now.
Sarah, one of the ironies is that this economic conflict, particularly around IRA, may actually generate better solutions for the pathway to emissions reduction and a greener planet. And yet, it is painful in the moment. It is painful between China and the United States, but it is particularly painful, it seems, for Europeans at the moment who thought that America was a natural partner on this journey, and now they find themselves catching up because European companies are now voting with their feet and moving their businesses to the United States to get access to the capital. Just give us your take on how this plays, because this is more the private sector working with governments to achieve greater goals and inevitably, I think, the panel would agree, largely make the systems more resilient.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we were talking about also before the panel is kind of the role of this building self-sufficiency, and does that build resilience versus, collaboration. And I do think it's really important to build on the lessons that we have learned over the last years with Russia, with COVID. I think that taught us a lot about on kind of that value of collaboration, and maybe the self-sufficiency being attractive kind of in the moment, but not for the long run, because our economies are so tied and interconnected, and so you get things like that of European companies coming to the U.S., for example, to capitalize on what those kind of gaps are. And I would say the same thing when we think about there's a lot of talk about the decoupling of the U.S. and China economies. But if you step back and really look at it, that's not really happening, right? There are sectors and there are interests of different governments that are very much real, this economic confrontation that's taking place in terms of sanctions, in terms of limitations on transfer of technology. But the reality is the economies remain really intertwined and that's good for everyone that they are. So that challenge is, how do we kind of use collaboration and to avoid that we kind of separate into camps of self-sufficiency in the name of resilience.
How do we do that?
A great question for me, but as the non-governmental person on the panel, right? I mean, I do think business has a real role here to step up and work with governments around the world and kind of demonstrate that value that in terms of growth that business brings, and the risks to it should kind of camp separate into self-sufficient.
Can I ask you a slightly unfair question? Probably, but
I guess you're going to ask it anyway.
To what extent do you think this narrative has now emerged because of Trump? And to what extent do you think having a Democrat administration that has at least talked the talk, if it hasn't necessarily always walked the walk, is taking us back to a world that we kind of thought we understood before Trump, where you had very clear friends globally and you worked with them, and you had very clear non-governmental and multilateral organizations that had roles in things like arbitrating labor disputes or trade disagreements and so on and so forth. Are we sort of past that history, or do you think there is still something in our future that will take us back to...
Well, I'm not predicting any
I'm just
candidates coming forward, because history has a way of repeating itself. But no, I don't think we're past it. I do think that the Biden administration has demonstrated, clearly a different approach to working with allies. However, the conflict with China is there, and to be honest, I think that's not really the one thing Republicans and Democrats agree on in the U.S. Congress is China. And that's a real challenge, and I think there's an element of needing to make sure that part of it is education, right? Like, do people really understand the impact of where this could play out? Recognizing there are real geopolitical security interests, but some of the economic sanctions that are more at this point discussed, not in place, they could really impact in a negative way also people in the United States and their cost of, their quality of life, and not to mention developing markets and kind of how that confrontation could play out for other parts of the world.
So while we're role-playing here and we're trying to come up with scenarios that improve resilience, improve growth, and improve the lot of most of us, is there anybody on the panel who doesn't think that engagement with China is the answer? That taking a much more confrontational approach is the answer to address what appears to be Xi Jinping's fragility and attitude towards international relations? No, I think we all agree then that China's part of it. So you need to engage rather than butt heads.
Yes, Ursula von der Leyen, she called it not decoupling, de-risking.
Right.
It's the de-risking question.
Which I'm not sure we really understand, do we?
Yes, perhaps that's the point.
Right.
That's de-risking means not to rely only on the power of China.
Right.
In Germany, we don't only make business with China, we make business in China. And this is could be riskful. And we rely on these for our sustainable Wärmewende, how to call it in English. So the climate change. We want to stop the climate change, and we want to transform our industry. But we are absolutely dependent on this on products from China, and this is really riskful. And we doesn't mean that we must decouple and struggle with words and diplomatic heat, but we must be aware of our position. That means de-risking, I would say, and find new partners in Australia or Mercosur, etc.
Saad, you know a lot about getting stuff around the world very efficiently from place to place without duplication, without frictional costs, without additional burdens. Having multiple partners increases all of those things.
That's exactly to your earlier question, to say that, in a sense, that it's binary, that either you were saying we're either working with China or not completely without it, is absolutely the wrong strategy, right? And whatever your preferred level of engagement is, you still need to say, look, the realities are, this is the system today, that, if we look at battery metals, for example, people are all focused on where's the lithium, where's the cobalt coming from. Well, actually, it's look at the refining processes. 90% of that value chain sits in China. So you're not going to overnight then be able to replace that. Do you want to then, create alternative sources that you can rely on? Yes. But, and what I was going to say is, as an economist and as a trader, the thing that we haven't talked about, price and cost, right? Which are two things that obviously, because why? When you're building these systems, when you're building resilience, right? Okay, so I think you're absolutely right. There isn't a trade-off between resilience and growth, but there is a cost to building resilient systems, right? And we've seen that repeatedly in the last few years. And there are two ways really of building resilient systems, I think if I'm oversimplifying a little bit, one is to continue building up, so in a sense almost like a fortress, right? So you keep building more and more solidity in walls. A little bit what you're a bit with Russia on energy is, okay, we were going to put a lot of our eggs in this basket to try and make sure that relationship is very solid. The other way to then is to build a flexible, responsive system, right? Which maybe they could have done if they said, look, we're going to invest in LNG export out of the US or wherever else, even though we don't need it today, but it creates more supply, creates more points that we can then rely on rather than a single point of failure, right? And I think you're right, where what has been remarkable to us, I think it has been the resilience of these systems over the last few years, right? And again, even the trade war back in 2019, COVID, the recovery, Ukraine conflict, by and large, I mean, we've had major disruptions, we've had significant costs, but the system has worked and responded such that energy and metals, all these things are still flowing. But as we look forward, we're saying, one of the things that we keep saying is that we are significantly underinvested across all of this, right? So there is a real cost to then say when we're looking forward to our energy transition goals, but even just our growth goals, right, is that we are not in a place that says, okay, we're going to be able to absorb bigger shocks from here on. With those shock absorbers that we had, that we spent a lot of money and time and resource building over the last 150 years, again, in oil markets and wherever else, but you don't have that. You don't have inventory. You don't have spare capacity. You don't have the trade relationships. And if you do start to get into a little bit more of a breakage into blocks, that overly complicates everything now already, right? And so I think for us, there's some real questions out there on that.
So I mean, I think we all understand just in time and why just in time evolved as the smartest, the least expensive, the most efficient way for manufacturers to do things. All of the things that you've just said would imply that we don't go back to that world in a sense. And if you take the model that we're going to have to duplicate to build in security, and is that what you would take away from both the experience with grain and oil from the Ukraine war?
Yes, I think that's it, right? Because we moved to just in time because it was the most cost-efficient system, but it was not the most fail-safe, most resilient in a sense. I mean, again, it has proven to be fairly resistant, but again, at a significant cost. So it's about where does that cost sit, right? Because you don't want to invest it now because you know that that's money going out the door and then not have to have that resilience later, right? But the problem is also you build systems and then you go, oh, well, that was a black swan event. We couldn't have seen that coming. And so many of these things are not black swans. They're what I think Xi Jinping terms gray rhinos, right? That they're actually right in front of you and you just choose not to see it. So when you're building these systems and you say, okay, how would we actually stress test this, right? What if you were to see, things that go out? The Saudi attack, the attacks on Abqaiq in Saudi, I don't know how many remember this, but in 2019, we were, at that point, we had much more in the way of inventories and everything else, but this took 5 million barrels a day of oil supply out of the global market. That could have been enough at a different time to crash the entire global economy, right? Because there's no backup to that system. But it costs a huge amount to do that, to hold spare capacity. So when we're trying to maximize profits, we're minimizing then this redundancy, right? And I think that's the kind of the key.
I think that's a really interesting point that comes out of this conversation, that largely you all agree that you have to build some duplication into the systems now to give you that redundancy in case it's needed. We're going to open this up to questions, so please indicate with your hand that you'd like to ask a question at this point, and we'll hand out the microphones. And while you're deciding whether you want to ask a question or not, I'm just going to ask Naoko a really unfair question. Do you think Japan has exhibited resilience for the last 40 years after the collapse in the economy and the property prices that happened? I mean, from an economic perspective, it almost feels like Japan has never really come back to the growth rates it exhibited. But yeah, you look at Japan and everybody seems to be having an okay time now, and it's full of tourists now, and there are lots of great cultural things to do while you're there. I know I'm massively stereotyping, but did Japan exhibit huge resilience, or did it fail?
Even for the last one day here, many people said to me that, oh, I love Japan. So that then apparently people do appreciate Japanese culture, then being a tourist, and then So I acknowledge it. At the same time, being a Japanese, particularly for the last 50 years, and then knowing that how Japan is thinking gradually, and losing a lot of, influence or relevance in the global economy, I don't think that we managed to get the resilience in our system. Rather, we are, because part of the social cohesion, we were kind of thinking together without creating a bunch of disruption. And so, in a sense, that we benefited from this social cohesion. At the same time, we really don't have this the power to get back and to even understand that if we are thinking or not, and if we don't like it, what to do. So that, to me, we are not necessarily presenting any kind of plausible the strategy for other countries to get in.
Thank you very much for the answer. You've got a microphone.
Yeah.
Could you just give us a little bit of background so we know where the question's coming from and direct it to whoever you'd like to ask?
Sure. Rob Rashat from Canada. I work for a company called Fortinet. We're in the cybersecurity industry. And given that, I'd like to ask, I guess I would direct this to our friend from Deloitte. In terms of all the risks to growth, where would you place cyber risk, particularly as those risks are starting to move from the enterprise to critical infrastructure, knowing that there's significant organized crime and state players involved?
Sure. So, I mean, when we think about cyber risk, it's one of those, when we think about enterprise risk management and we think about our heat map, it's always up there. It's never going to fall, right? There's always a new scheme, a new criminal, a new attack method that's out there. I wouldn't predict that we've kind of mastered that, but I do feel like there is some more stability that we see in terms of, at least from a business standpoint, there's been a heck of a lot more investment. I think there's a better level of understanding than maybe there was a few years ago about how impactful cybersecurity is. So in this panoply of risks that we're looking at, it's always one of the top risks. Does it rise above geopolitics? Does it rise above, the current financial stability, interest rate environment? It's hard to say those things as you compare them, but certainly a very top risk.
And for us, sorry, just real quick, I mean, we've seen it again in commodity markets where you've had ransomware attacks on the largest, gasoline pipeline in the U.S., right? And again, thankfully you were able to solve that, but if that had been more than a few days, that would have been, again, economically ruinous, and we don't have a backup system for that line. And the interaction now between geopolitics and cybersecurity as well, where, shall we say, we have a few possibly state-backed organizations who are part of some of these attacks, right? And we saw that even in Europe, the largest copper smelter went down after they said we weren't going, and these are things that are important, right? And have not yet, I think, risen to that level of discussion.
Gentleman there.
Christian Keller, Chief Economist for Barclays. It's really a question to the entire panel. I'm not convinced. It started off with a great fanfare protest that resilience and growth was not exclusive and it all went together. But, we ended up talking about redundancies, about voluntarily creating inefficiencies. The Sahid, finally brought the issue of price and costs. and now, in the end, we may be playing with semantics and redefining what kind of growth we mean. But fact is, it does seem to me something that is a less efficient world, and typically efficiency and growth is related. So that was my question to the panel. And one quick thing on Japan, just because it came up. I really think we need to start talking a bit differently about Japan when we talk about growth in particular. GDP per capita in Japan, and I think Ishii, you would confirm this, has been as good as in other countries. They just have low population growth and declining population, but per capita, if that is what we want to measure, how people are individually, Japan is doing well. They're not sinking.
Well, if you want to talk about resilient, 40 years and you're still the third largest economy, right? So there's some resilience there.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. Absolutely. But let's take the other point. So I think that's interesting. To you, I think it's a pushback. It's a pushback on growth and resilience. Yeah. Do you want to address?
I think so.
If there is any kind of short-term conflict It may be true, but when we talk about growth, it's going to be longer term, a sustainable growth. I think we are talking about from that point of view, the longer term sustainable growth. It is that at odds with the planetary system, because we don't really price that the natural capital, and it's not really sustainable because of human capital, because we completely not ignore, but that under current system, we really don't do justice to the global south. So that when I see this huge challenge coming anytime soon from climate system or natural system, and also that an injustice to the global south, I actually don't think the current growth is the good thing to have. And in that sense, the growth, in my own definition, and resilience will be compatible.
Sorry, just quickly then from my side to add as well, right, is to build these redundancies, it's still investment, right? You still have to then employ people to go build some of these things. So there's still, okay, and you can argue, is it the most efficient use of capital in the short term? Again, maybe not. But also then what you don't want to have is to find out that you don't have a resilient system, because the cost to growth at that point could be significant, right? And again, we did see that in Europe last year. We didn't really have quite as resilient an energy system as we wanted, so the cost became enormous, right? As opposed to saying, okay, if we'd invested maybe some of that earlier, we would have built more redundancy and more points of access, right? So it's a little bit, I think, there that depends on your definition. So,
and I think there's also the what do we mean by short term and what do we mean by medium term? Because if we think kind of, well, we've got to manage a crisis every few years or so, then that, you're right, it's investment out the door today that we might take advantage of in 5 years from now. But we've just seen crisis upon crisis upon crisis, that the short term is getting very squeezed.
And my point of view concerning growth, what do I understand with the word or under the word growth? It's not only a benefit for a few people or a few companies. I think growth means resilient needs a strong economy, I would say, in order to invent solutions or to make researches. And researches not only in one country, make researches together and find solutions. Second point is growth means well-being and welfare for people, not only in the European Union. It means growth to become stronger and have not a same mindset. That's not possible, but a mindset concerning climate change, for example, and what sustainability means. Combined or included with growth. And then I think this makes us stronger in order to be more resilient, in order to be faster, for example, to invent vaccine or other things, or to finance the transformation, to finance it. We can describe all our aims or wishes. And in Germany, we have such an emotional, sometimes an ideological debate concerning climate change, concerning the energy sources, what could or should we use or not. And Fridays for Futures or younger people, they are sitting on the streets all day long and want to get into the discussions. So I think we must be realistic in order to describing our aims and goals, and has to point out how we can finance it on the long run and to be successful. And so I mentioned it at the beginning. I think that resilience and growth are two sides of the same coin.
Any more questions? Let's get you a microphone over here then, if we can. Good. We've got about 5 minutes left, so let's take the question and see where we are.
Can you afford to be resilient without growth?
Sorry?
Can you afford to be resilient without growth?
Gosh, now
is there a precursor?
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
In 5 minutes. But thank you. Would anybody like to take that one on quickly? No, I think we
Yeah.
basically...
Quickly. I don't think.
No.
No.
Okay.
No, yeah.
Right. So there you go. I think that's all you're getting. That's all. Look, let me just finish with the final question here, because the most
In a globalized world now.
the most well, I guess it feels like the most immediate crisis we've seen recently to do with the financial system has been in the banks. And we all came through 2008 and we all thought, never again. We're never going to give those bankers any more money and let them bust the system again, right? And here we are,
Yeah.
2023, and we're suddenly giving the banks money. And we have institutions like the FDIC, which have overreached their rules of operation effectively to provide stability in the US banking system. And we've had a government that's had to step in here, much to people's huge annoyance here, and basically shut down Credit Suisse and merge it with UBS, apparently breaking all sorts of conventions and understandings about what was acceptable to do with banks. So let me wrap up with a final question here, because sometimes it seems to be resilient, you have to either break the rules or make them up as you're going along. In the case of this most recent financial plumbing problem, is everybody on this panel comfortable that it goes no further? Or are any of you concerned that actually what we're just witnessing is the first round in a Tyson-esque boxing match that is going to run a few more months yet?
I mean, I think that's
Who would like to take the question?
I mean, for me, it's Buffett's famous quote, where we don't know who's swimming naked till the tide goes out, and this is the tide going out. We don't know what the risks are. How many people knew what a CDO was in 2007? Even the bank CEOs didn't know what that was, right? So it wasn't until the stresses started to show up that you were able to say, oh, this is where the risks are. We were talking about this at lunch with some people, where it's the amount of leverage that is in the private side this time that is held is significant, right? And we don't know that until the mark-to-market actually happens. And that's when you will start to, I think, see some of these cracks emerge. So I'm not saying that this is a cascading financial crisis like '08, but that there are stresses in the system that are probably not adequately looked after. But again, you could also argue that we are too afraid of passing costs on to consumers and to businesses to be able to actually take some of the medicine that is needed.
Anybody else fancy a go?
We never know which.
Right.
Yeah, really. So politics, for example, has to react in the situation we are, and you can't predict what you try to predict. But if a situation occurs, you have to react, and then you have to decide what's worse or what's better. Not the best, but in this case. And I think, yes, we have a lot to do. It will never end.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I feel reassured after, because it seems to me it's hard to create resilience against something you don't understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how many in the room, except maybe one or two of the bankers, maybe know how much is buried.
Undoubtedly, in 2 or 3 years from now, we will look back and say, well, we perfectly well had all the information in front of us to know what all the risks were and exactly how long this would last and how this would unfold. But of course, in the moment, it's never that clear, right?
Yeah.
You get the last word.
I think the question is that who is paying the price or the additional cost of this resilience? Actually, I think that the people, the business demand that is at the end of the day, it is their benefit. The politicians, the policy makers, some of them government are quite short-sighted. At the end of the day, it's all us that who are paying for the lack of, the foresight. Yeah. So I hope that you mentioned a little bit like the business can demand more, and I think that the business and the people, not only global north, by the way, also global south, should demand more about the system needs to incorporate the resilience and the entire system, the citizens should be ready to pay for that.
And that's a great final message to end on, I think. So thank you very much to our panel for this very, very interesting conversation. Thank you. Thank you.